related to adult abuse and child abuse were being implemented, and that staff had knowledge of that. And the facility has policies and procedures related to that. As a complaints coordinator, oftentimes I will get an allegation related to abuse at a personal care home. My responsibility is to triage that to determine the seriousness of it, the validity of it, and if we need an investigation. I try to get as much information as possible. We have a different role with the Office of Inspector General than what DCBS does, or some people refer to them as permanency and protection, or adult protective services or child protective services. When they come out to your facility, their role is pretty straightforward. It's very linear, is the way I like to describe it. They're coming out to say, did Jane Doe abuse Mary Smith, or did she neglect Mary Smith, or did she exploit or steal something from her? So they're pretty much focusing on those two individuals. They're going to talk to you as the administrator or director of nursing, or maybe as part of an interview. They're pretty much focusing on, did this event happen? This specific event. When we come in, the specific event is sort of like an invitation to your facility. But remember, we're a regulatory agency. We're looking at enforcement. So we're looking at systems. So we will look at, did this staff member abuse, neglect, or exploit this resident? That is going to be part of our investigation. But we're also going to look at, do you have policies and procedures to prevent this? We're also going to look at, did you do criminal record checks and nurse aid abuse registry checks on your staff? So we're going to pull a sample of staff records to look at. We're going to pull a sample of residents to look at. We're going to do interviews. So we're actually, the specific event gets us in your facility, but then we expand. Where usually DCBS is, like I said, very linear. So when we come in and we're expanding, remember, you've got to make sure your staff are well versed on the laws, even if they don't. Like if I ask somebody, can you tell me the types of abuse? And that staff member just freezes up. Oh, the state's here, they're asking me questions. I can't remember. But they've gone through orientation. You've done backup trainings. You've got policies and procedures, and they're aware of them. We've all been there where we freeze on something. So I'm mindful of that. We train our surveyors to be mindful of that. So then we ask secondary questions. Well, give me some examples of what you would consider different types of abuse. That's usually where we end up getting knowledge that these individuals really understand it. Well, if you slap somebody, say, well, another word for that might be physical. Yes, that's right, physical abuse. Oh, yeah, and sexual abuse. And so lots of times I can tell if somebody knows. I understand that. Then I ask them, tell me what you do. What's the facility policies? When do you report that? Who do you report it to? If they're telling me, oh, well, yeah, as long as, if it happens on Friday night, there's only nobody here, so I'll wait till Monday. That's not a good answer. So with that, I'm looking at policies, procedures, reporting. I'm looking at that the state law is met, that residents feel comfortable in your facility. They're not fearful. That staff aren't fearful. Oh, that's the administrator's sister-in-law. I couldn't possibly tell her about that. No, that's not a good answer either. So just make sure that it's not just to, I'm talking about this, gearing this toward you, that when the state comes in, or when OIG comes in, but really, truly, this is about keeping the residents of your home protected and safe. And they need to feel safe. There's nothing better than hearing a resident say, well, no, nothing like that goes on here. No, these little girls that take care of me, they wouldn't let that happen for nothing. Or no, I don't know where you got that information. That's a lie. Nobody here would do something like that. I love hearing that. Because that person, this is their home, they feel comfortable. Or a resident said, no, if that happened, I would go straight to Miss Jeannie, I'd go straight to Miss Sandy, I'd go right to Mr. Jeff, and I would tell them this is going on, and they'd take care of it. They wouldn't let nothing like that happen. That's a good thing to hear. Or for staff to say, yeah, I know them, it's this, and this, and have to do an orientation, and then our administrator drags us in, every 6 months we have to go over it again, and the ombudsman was here the other day and spoke to us, and okay, I'm sorry, but good. I'm glad to hear that. Those are positive things. So make sure they are very aware, because it is so easy for somebody to do something that maybe they didn't normally do. And without little reminders, without little checks, without supervision of your staff, things can happen. Nobody walks into your facility with a little sign on their head that says, I'm an abuser. So it's up to you to make sure. And then there's always a first for everything. You know, she's worked with us for 10 years, never once did anything. And then last night, she slapped a resident. So, and you know, there could be all kinds of extenuating circumstances. But it's not an excuse. So then what did the facility do? So just to leave you with that. And there's copies of both of these laws in the manuals that you guys got. And with that also, Jackie Aiken from the Lexington office is the, wave at us, Jackie, is the complaints coordinator in Lexington. I'm in Louisville, so she's in Eastern. I'm in Northern. She's in Lexington, which is Eastern. Right? Eastern. Thank you. See, I'm not just incontinent. So anyway, you can call Jackie. Sorry about this, Jackie. But if you have a question about something you're not sure, call Jackie or call the regional program manager, Connie Payne in Lexington. Call myself or Millie Zunstein. We have the regional program manager from London back here, Sandy. So, and then I don't think we have anybody from Hopkinsville, but call the office if you're not sure of something and ask them a question. And you can be anonymous if you want. You can call and say, I don't want to tell you who I am. I don't want to tell you the name of my facility. And we don't have caller ID, so you're okay. Ask your question. Find out what's going on. We've had providers in here that have actually said, hey, can we have a meeting? We have something. We want you to be successful. That I would love if every survey ended up with no deficiency. That means every one of these regulations, which are minimum standards to start with, are being met. I want you to be as successful as you can be, because that means when it's time for me to go to a personal care home, I'm going to be happy. And I'm one of those people that is really going to be a pain to somebody one day. So anyway, please feel free to call. If you can't get hold of somebody in a particular office, because there are days like I'm on the phone constantly, so I may not be able to call you back until tomorrow, and you have to talk to somebody, call in and tell them, you know, this is really important to talk to somebody right now. I don't mean to be a pest, you know, that whole thing about honey and vinegar. Be sweet, you get further. Do that. Let us know how important it is. And you can call our central office. I'm sure Samantha's going to love you for this, but truthfully, call. Because if we don't have the answer, we'll get it. I'd rather you have the information you need to be successful than to be out there floundering. And I think most people feel comfortable with that, but I just wanted to reiterate.
And there's more than one assistant director at central office. Her name is Katie Meany. She's her. And Diana Mullins. You can all provide assistance.
Okay, moving on. Patient rights. We've talked about this. We're going to go over patient rights later in the day. But basically, the facility is responsible for making sure they have policies and procedures related to patient rights also, and that those patient rights are being met. And remember, patient rights, when we go over them, we'll talk about that. But remember, each person is an individual, so we need to keep that in mind when we're meeting patient rights. What's going on way? Okay, transfer and discharge. We're going to talk about that also. And this pretty much means that the facility, personal care home regs say you have to meet transfer and discharge. Okay? And we're going to talk about that later also. As part of transfer and discharge, you have to have written policies related to transfer and discharge, and this talks about this. Also, it talks about, let's see, is this the one where it talks about having agreements?
Yes.
You're going to have to be able to, and everybody's been through this, where the surveyor says, can you show me your agreements that you have with other healthcare facilities? Everybody understand how that works? It's not really convoluted. It doesn't have to be in great detail, but you've got to have written agreements with other facilities that you participate with, that you may transfer someone to or accept someone from. Are there any questions about that? So I don't want to go through something that maybe somebody's not clear on, but I don't want to spend an inordinate amount of time on things that everybody's like, yeah, we got that. That's really not an issue. Do you want Okay, this talks about transfer and making sure this is going through the resident's physician when their condition is not within the scope of what the facility can be providing. So the physician needs to be involved in this. Anytime you have a discharge, short of maybe there being a money issue, if it has to do with the safety of residents in your home, with meeting a resident's healthcare needs, with the resident has improved where they no longer need care in this facility, I would have the physician involved. I think it's going to add credibility to your reasoning for discharging this individual, and it also may open your eyes to a few things. You're like, well, maybe not. Maybe what the physician is saying, we need to take another look at. Okay, but it does talk.
The key also with this, I'm sorry, Jerry, is this reg requires that the administrator shall initiate that transfer. You know, back to what we discussed earlier, you don't initiate the transfer, even if they're above the level of care. It's your responsibility as an administrator, whoever's operating this facility, to initiate that transfer and getting that as soon as your facility becomes aware that they're requiring too much assistance. It's your responsibility as an administrator to initiate that transfer and take that action. A lot of times we see where they're dealing with family, they're not really initiating a transfer. When we come out and we investigate, we're going to ask for evidence where you have initiated the transfer. How long have you known that this resident is above the level of care, and when did you start taking action? You've got to be able to show us the evidence that you have initiated and when you initiated it.
You know, we've talked about talking to the family and the responsible party. The resident is part of this. This is their life. So they should be aware of these kinds of things also. They should be knowing. They should know from you exactly what's going on. So if there's an issue that you may be looking at this person who needs to be transferred because they're actually have declined to the point where they may not need to be in personal care, if that person is understanding this and they're appropriate for personal care, they should kind of understand this. Now, there may be some cognitive issues, or there may be because of healthcare issues, they may not. But for the most part, they should have an understanding of what's going on and have knowledge that, you know, they may be moving. Now, you're going to have to handle that and be very delicate, because pretty much what you're telling them is that one day we're kicking you out of your home. And I know that's an ugly way to put it, but that's how they're going to see it. So those things are important. Don't let this be a surprise. Nobody wants to go home tonight and have a notice that you have to leave tomorrow. That's not going to be a fun thing. It's not fun even when you are prepared for it, but not to even have any inkling it's coming is really a big blow. So be aware of that resident's feelings. And, you know, I come into this facility, I'm not part of your home, I'm not part of your culture. It's easy for me to write this deficiency to tell you this person's other level of care, and you kept them out of your level of care. Because then I go back to my office. You've grown very attached to this person. We understand that. We understand that your staff. I mean, I've been in facilities where the staff are just breaking down crying because they know my questions, what they're getting to. And they don't want this person to leave. I understand that. I really do. But it doesn't, I can't circumvent the regulations. They are what they are. So, I mean, you can think of me as, you know, that ogre Jerry who came out and made poor little Miss Effie leave. That's okay, but it is a regulation and we have to do it. And I've been in situations out there where I've felt, gosh, I don't want to leave either. Everybody's so happy here. But it is what it is. So be aware of that and make that transition for her, even though you don't want her to leave, even though you care about it, make that transition for her as easy as you possibly can. Okay? 88, and this once again still transfer and discharge, talks about current summary of the resident's medical records shall accompany the resident. Don't get caught up in being angry because a resident has to leave or feeling like, gosh, we're being put upon, and take it out on the resident by not making sure every single thing that you can do for that resident is done. Making sure that that record, well, this facility gave me hardly any information and we've had nothing but problems. This resident's leaving, let the next facility worry about it. Don't be better than the people who treated you that way, okay? But even more so than that, you're required to by regulation, so, okay? We're at 89. This is TB testing. Okay, all employees and residents shall be tested for tuberculosis in accordance with the provisions of the regulation, which we're going to talk about TB testing later. So, but that's pretty definitive. The personal care home reg says all, and if we need a definition of all, we'll look it up. But I can pretty much tell you that means everybody. Everybody. If they're working in that personal care home or they're a resident, they get tested. Now, that test doesn't have to be an actual TB test. There's the regulations that talk about that. There are other things that can be done. But you've got to have something, and you can't just say, yes, she got tested. I got to have some kind of proof. I got to have something, okay? And we'll talk about that in the TB test. Operators and employees of personal care homes have to comply with, and then once again, we get into talking about laws, about a person who's on the nurse aid abuse registry, okay? Here's one of the things you have to be careful with, and a lot of times this happens. Some facilities hire certified nurse aides, is what everybody refers to them. Actually, there's not a true certification process, but we're gonna go with the standard format, certified nurse aides. Some don't. What this talks about is if they're in your facility and they're providing services, they have to be checked, even though it's the maintenance director, even though it's housekeeping, and they have to be checked before they're hired. Okay? So we'll make sure that's very clear to everybody, and you have to be able to provide us that proof. So if I'm going through records and I see their hire date is September 1st, 2009, and then I see that your nurse aid abuse registry check was September 7th, 2009, there better be some kind of proof they didn't start until the 7th or after. Because their application says hire date, and sometimes that happens. Sometimes somebody's hired, but their start date's different. So make sure you got somebody in your records department who can explain that, especially if it happened in September, it's one thing, but if I look at something that was 5 years ago or 4 years ago, you got to make sure you got some clear records. Because what happens if you have an employee that you don't have a nurse aid abuse registry check on, or you have it, but it happened after they started? What's one of the things I'm going to look at? Are you protecting your residents from abuse? Because just because somebody didn't get slapped doesn't mean you can't get a deficiency for protecting residents from abuse because you didn't do this registry check. This is a requirement. So then you do the registry check and you find out they're on the register for abusing residents. You let somebody come to work providing one-on-one care with your residents who's on the registry for abusing residents. How can you tell me that you protected your residents from abuse when you let somebody come in and do that? Okay? It's something that you need to be very aware of.
If you look in your manuals, if you go to tab 5, you're going to see a tab that says employment screening statutes. And I know not everybody has one before them because we're only able to give one per licensed entity. There's a nice little employment screening statutes cheat sheet for you, and it details all of those requirements as it relates to the nurse aid abuse registry, but it also goes into how you're supposed to screen as it relates to criminal background checks and what your requirements are. I really strongly advise you to take a look at that. One of the aspects is KRS 216.789, and it's prohibition against employing certain felons at a long-term care facility in nursing pools, providing staff to nursing facilities or in assisted living communities, pre-employment check with Justice and Public Safety Cabinet temporary employment. One of the key issues here is just because you do a criminal background check, you have to look at it. You have to review what the information is that comes back to you. Now, if they have absolutely nothing on the criminal background check, and there's not anything of concern that you're aware of, also remember that our state law requires only that you do the state of Kentucky criminal background check. That does not mean that the persons you're hiring in your facility have not committed a criminal act and been convicted outside of the state. How many of you border of Tennessee or West Virginia? There's always that potential. When you become aware somehow, and not through the Kentucky criminal background check, aware of something that raises the hair on the back of your neck, you are then knowledgeable. And you probably would be best advised to take action on that information and find out if it is accurate for the safety of your residents and the residents within your facilities and any potential residents you might be admitting. One thing that's also important is understanding what you're looking for. And under the number 1, it says no long-term care facility as defined by KRS 216.5351. Nursing pool providing staff to a nursing facility or assisted living community shall knowingly, and understand that, knowingly, employ in a position which involves providing direct services to a resident or a client if that person has been convicted of a felony offense related to theft, abuse, or sale of illegal drugs, abuse, neglect, or exploitation of an adult or a sexual crime. Now that's a felony. A whole bunch of stuff falls into those categories. A whole bunch. It does also specify that a nursing facility, nursing pool providing staff to a nursing facility or assisted living community may employ persons convicted of or pleading guilty to an offense classified as a misdemeanor if the crime is not related to abuse, neglect, or exploitation of an adult. One thing that I will ask you, or I want you to consider, is when you hire persons who do have a criminal background and your statement to the surveyor is, well, they don't provide direct services to our resident. Be prepared to describe how you're monitoring that that person is not providing direct services to a resident if they have a criminal background that is defined in this nature, okay? Personal care homes are defined as a long-term care facility based on our statute. So just be prepared and be knowledgeable. And when you look at a criminal background check and you don't know the answer and there's something that you question, call and ask them. Ask what that means. Because just like Jerry said before, ignorance is not bliss. And you are supposed to know what these things are. The best thing you can do is to call and ask questions. A lot of times you will actually, we just recently came across a criminal background check for someone that specified that the entity, the person had some kind of plea. I can't think of what it said, Sandy. Do you recall? You know who I'm talking about?
It's not coming to me either.
It's like it had a little line on there that said some kind of plea agreement, or, and it may not have been that in quotes.
Reckless abuse of an adult.
Reckless abuse of adult,
something like that.
And the facility, or they didn't make sure that they understood what that meant. Well, after the state agency digged into it, they found that this person was not to have any involvement in any kind of facility dealing with elderly. But that facility did not take further stance, did not look into it further. They said, oh, well, there's not a felony offense. But you have to look deeper into those things and find out more information. Not everything, unfortunately, even with your criminal background checks, is black and white. So
another thing that we talked about here, and you have to be careful because you're operating a personal care home, you have a particular type of clientele or residents in your home. So when you're reading this state law, in your head you're thinking our residents. But the state law doesn't say residents in a personal care home. This one particular, the one that talks about misdemeanors, about if they're convicted of a misdemeanor, they may work in your facility unless, and it goes on to talk about abuse of an adult. That adult doesn't have to be a vulnerable adult. The law is not saying a vulnerable adult. So, you're 18 years old, you're newly married because you're ready for marriage, you're ready for life, everything's going to be wonderful. We get out there, and all of a sudden, well, she or he, or they're not exactly what I thought they were. And the next thing you know, your fights have escalated and you do something dumb. The police get called. Now you're before a judge. And the judge says, okay, here's what my thoughts are. I'm going to give you both a misdemeanor. You're going to go to some kind of counseling. You're not going to beat each other up anymore. Go out there and take care of it. It's the only thing you ever did. It's done. It's over with. Now you're 40. You have a misdemeanor charge of adult abuse. You can't work in this personal care home. It wasn't that you deliberately, intentionally abused 75-year-old sweet grandma. This was something you did way back in youth that was dumb. There's no doubt in anybody's mind it was dumb. It seems a little unfair, but that's what the law says. And this is law. This isn't a regulation. This is law. So if there is a misdemeanor related to abuse of an adult, it doesn't describe what type of adult. So if you're at a bar and you're 20 years old and two guys get in a fight and somehow the judge decides to make it a misdemeanor charge of abuse, it is abuse. Okay? So it may not fit, and that person may be looking at you saying, oh, come on, that was 20 years ago. That was in my youth. I was doing something dumb. It had nothing to do with taking care of people. That's what the law says. So now you, if you hire them, are going to have to explain to us why you didn't meet this law. So be very aware of that. And people can go back and have judges change things. It's rare, but it does happen. They have to put on a pretty good case for it. But as a licensee, as a healthcare facility, you have to meet this law. So I want you to just kind of think a little bit outside the box. It may appear on the surface to be very black and white, but sometimes it's not. You have to think about that.
One other thing to add is your nurse aid abuse registry. What we want you to also realize is that doesn't mean that if John Doe, who's never worked as a state registered nurse aide in the state of Kentucky, went out and abused grandma in a facility, but they never became a state registered nurse aide, their name's not going to show up on this register. If you're a licensed nurse, if you're the maintenance man, he was never a state registered nurse aide, his name will never show up on this nurse aide registry. So that's even more important for you to understand. State registered nurse aides show up on the nurse aid abuse register. If you hire a licensed practical nurse or you hire a registered nurse in your facility, you have to do a nurse aid abuse registry check, right? You check it, their name's not on there. Doesn't mean anything other than the fact that their name is not on there. They may have never been a state registered nurse aide who had a finding against them as it relates to abuse. So understand that this is not the end-all, be-all for identification of persons who have been identified as having a history of abuse. Know what these checks are and what they encompass so that you can make better decisions on choosing the right persons to provide care to your population.
The other thing, quickly, and we'll move on, is that has anybody ever suspected somebody of doing something but they didn't have the proof? They knew it happened. There's not a doubt in their mind that they didn't have the proof. That happens with us more often than not. Lots of times you're dealing with vulnerable adults. You're dealing in a situation where there are no witnesses. So, and we have to have a preponderance of proof. In this country, we don't have to have proof that stands up in a court of law necessarily. We like it if we do, but we have to have a preponderance of evidence. We've got to feel very comfortable in making a recommendation to the Nurse Aid Abuse Registry, but that individual does get a hearing rights. And if we can't prove our case to that administrative law judge, they're not going to put them on that register. Okay? So there are times we lose those cases, and yet I feel very comfortable in saying just all the circumstantial stuff tells me this happened, and they're not on it. lots of times also, and I think this has to do with legal reasons, you'll call to get a reference on somebody. And the facility you call won't give you much information. Yes, she worked here. She doesn't work here now. She worked here 3 years. That's about it. They don't tell you we fired her because of the 16th complaint that she was rough with people or that she spoke nasty. So that's kind of one of those things. So look at references. Try to do your best with your application. Make sure you supervise. And make sure that if you see a problem with somebody, you can have an excellent employee who loses their mother, their husband tells them, or their wife tells them, I'm leaving you, their kid's diagnosed with some horrible thing. They can be an excellent employee, and you put enough stress on somebody, they're going to snap. And unfortunately, they're in a high-pressure job to start with, and that's the day they're trying to assist somebody, and the resident hauls off and slaps them. And they snap. So be aware of what's going on with your employees also. I know we keep loading more and more on you, but it truly is a responsibility of the facility. Continuous personnel, we talked about employee records have to be maintained. They have to include the employee's training experience, evidence of any sort of licensure, registration, certification if required by law, and then you have to have the employee's health records have to be maintained and updated and current, and then also an evaluation of their performance, and then actual identifying information, name, address, social security number, things like that. And if they move, update your records. You know, because I've actually talked to staff that were like, good Lord, that was 10 years ago and 8 different addresses ago, and you know, those things happen. And lots of times they don't tell you. So you may want to do something just periodically where you update your records, or asking your staff, you know, can you make sure we're double checking that we have all the current information. In more rural areas, that's not such a problem. More urban areas, lots of times I think it is a problem. People may know each other at work, but that's it. So they don't know that, you know, Susie moved down the road to Mrs. Johnson's old farmhouse or something. But it's still important because it is a requirement that it's in here. And not being able to get hold of somebody, not knowing where their address is, we've got some issues. Because let's say that they are nursing in your facility and we want to put them on the register. We have to have all that information. So. Also, they have to be of an age that conforms to state law. So be careful that your granddaughter, who loves the residents and comes to visit occasionally and maybe assists with some activities in your facility, now all of a sudden she's going in, helping people dress or helping people with baths, and she's not of an appropriate age. Doesn't matter she's so much older than her years. No, don't worry. Okay? And I think that's pretty obvious. Also, if you have somebody who has an infectious disease or appears to have an infectious disease, make sure that you're being responsible with that. Okay? Because they're not supposed to be at work until you can substantiate, or you can have reasonable belief that they're no longer infectious. And to me, that's going to be, you need to get something from a healthcare provider to say that they can return to work. Because if they end up with, right now it's swine flu, and they come in and everybody in your facility gets it, and then somebody calls and says, well, you know, Jerry came into their facility and they knew he was sick, and now everybody there's sick. You're responsible if we come out and we verify that you knew that, and you let him come in, and you didn't verify that he was cleared to come in, it's going to be on the facility's shoulder for not meeting this particular regulation. All dietary, and why this is here, I don't know, but all dietary employees have to wear hearing aids. Okay? And that's important. Somebody comes into your kitchen to survey your kitchen. Do they have to wear a hairnet? If I'm in your kitchen, can your dietary manager say, I need you to put this hairnet on? Not only can they should. Because I'm not exempt for that. I may not be an employee of your facility, but you still are responsible. Your residents don't want my hair in their food any more than they want yours. So anybody in your kitchen needs to be wearing a hairnet. Okay? Now, can you tell us a pet peeve? Yeah. In-service training correspond with duties of respective jobs. Samantha talked about staff being knowledgeable of what they're doing, okay? So you may have an excellent training, and there's even a list of things people have to receive training on that we're going to talk about. But I really need to tell you, that list is, I don't want to say that, I don't want to say that about any regulation, but that list is very superficial to a degree. Your individual residents should gear your training needs. So if you have somebody that is violent, or you have somebody that has depressive, suicidal thoughts, your staff need to be aware of how to handle those individual residents. Even though the regulations say you have to have this, 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 and this, and you're like, well, yes, we train them in the, emotional process of, or emotional, I'm trying to think, I'm trying to think of the regulation now.
We've helped them to identify what the signs and symptoms
Yes.
are of suicidal ideations, and that we want to make sure that they know what has to happen and that they communicate these things too. Because you as an administrator, or maybe as a director of nursing, may not be out on that floor providing that one-on-one care with that resident and seeing those necessarily. You might be calling the doctor, getting doctor's orders, taking care of those administrative type duties and not seeing what's actually happening out there. So your responsibility as the administrator is to make sure that your staff who are providing that one-to-one care can identify the problems, know what to look for. If you have somebody who goes into a manic phase of depression, we had a situation not too long ago in a facility where the resident has a diagnosis of manic depressive disorder, and what was told through that investigation, what we found out was interviewing the sister. She specified that her sister actually, when she's getting ready to plunge into her manic depressive state, starts taking off, meaning eloping, not going to get married. She just leaves. That sister made the facility aware of that prior to admission. And she starts refusing things. For 3 weeks ahead of time, that resident started refusing things. She wouldn't take a bath. She wouldn't eat. She wouldn't go here. She wouldn't go there. She refused her medications. All the signs and symptoms were there. The facility had been made aware upon admission. They never developed a care plan to address it. They never told their staff what to look for. It went on for 3 weeks. And then one day, they took her out with the other residents. They went to Walmart, and I know it's exciting at Walmart shopping. She was crazed about books, and so they couldn't get her out of the book section of Walmart. And then they couldn't get her into the van. It took an act of Congress and God to get her in the van and back to the facility. By 10 o'clock that night, she had eloped from that facility and left. The facility didn't know she was gone. Had no idea. The signs and symptoms were there. Staff didn't know what the signs and symptoms were. And the facility had been told. The administrator who admitted that resident to the facility had been told by the family. That family history is important. The knowledge of what those signs and symptoms are is important. It's important for your staff to be communicated with, to know what to look for. And if they do have aggressive behaviors, how to address those. And as part of the personnel record, it's your requirement to ensure that you're providing that in-service training and you have documented in-service training, and that you also went back to make sure that your staff understood the training that they received. It's one thing to just train Jerry on what the definition of abuse is, but if I don't go back and make sure that they understand, then I haven't really ensured that my training was effective. So it's also your responsibility to make sure that the training you do provide is effective. And that way, when you're actually going out there and you're providing the care, you can ensure the competence of your staff who you've trained.
And then make sure we keep a record of that training in that employee's file, so that it's important that you be able to provide that documentation to show that the training has been completed. And then it goes on to talk about that record should include who gave the training, the date, the period of time was given, and a summary of what the training was given. I would say the summary is what most people fall down on. I will see a sign-in sheet that says abuse, and then everybody signs it. It's got the date and time. There needs to be something. It doesn't have to be, the next great American novel, but you do need to have a summary of what that is. And you can attach a copy of the law 209, and then we went over reporting requirements. We got this poster from DCBS was given to us. We posted it in our break room. Just basic summary to tell us what that was. This talks about, and here's what we were talking about. So this is a list of training that's required to be given to your staff, okay? And I don't know, is everybody's familiar with this? And the second one from the bottom was what I was trying to remember. So if you've given a training on the emotional problems of illness to your staff, I mean, how vague is that? That's really vague. You can get into really specifics of stuff, but then if I come in and say, talk to me about this resident who hung himself in the bathroom. What were the signs? What was going on? I don't know. He seemed to be fine to me. And then later on I find out he was admitted to the facility because he'd had a stroke. He couldn't live by himself anymore. He lost his farm. His only child, who's coming to visit him 3 times a week, had a heart attack and died. But there were no signs that he was depressed. There was nothing going on. We don't know why he hung himself. And of course, he'd lost 12 pounds because he stopped eating. He wouldn't come out of his room anymore. And he gave away half of his personal items. But there's really no signs. Well, maybe, this is 2009. Most of us know those are all signs. But there are people out there that may not know that. So your staff needs to be aware. Mr. Smith has suffered a tremendous amount of loss very recently. Or it may not be that black and white. That's to all of us, we would be like, oh my gosh. But just going into a personal care home, to a lot of people, is a huge loss of just control over their day-to-day lives. Becoming incontinent. Come on. That's something I sit here and think of, we were kind of laughing about that, but that would be horrible. I would just be mortified by that. That would be very depressing to me. So, and then to add one thing after another. I'm very much a homebody, and I love my home. But so being taken out of my home and then have to use a bathroom that is not my bathroom, having to sleep in a room that's not my room, to just not being able to get around as easily as possible. Those are all very depressing things to me. So your staff need to be aware of that sort of thing, even if it's generalized. But especially if you have somebody that you've received information on admission, this person is prone to depression, or this person has a history of, suicidal ideation or attempts even. So it was 20 years ago. That doesn't mean it wouldn't happen again. So just be very aware of training to your staff and when things come up. There's no way you're going to catch 100% every single thing that happens, but do your best. And that way, at least you're doing everything you can for the residents, and make sure you're documenting these things so that your staff can catch things. Because it is amazing. There's too many stories to tell you about how staff have just, because they get to know residents, and they're like, I don't know what it is, but it was something. She was acting different. So I just decided I'd check on her more often that night, and walked in and caught her with a plastic bag over her head trying to kill herself. And the staff just knew that there was something, knew something about the resident. Receiving that additional information about that she had received some really significant bad things, that she had had some suicidal issues in the past, alerted that staff to be aware, to be a little more, and that resident was safe. So those things are very important. Had she not had any of that information, maybe she was intuitive enough to have still checked on her, or maybe not. But as far as I'm concerned, the facility did a great job by making sure the staff were aware of all that. So.
In regards to use of medications and therapeutic diets, how many of you have an actual licensed nurse who's administering meds in your facility? Okay, it's very few, right? How many of you actually have someone who's not a licensed nurse administering meds? Okay, it's your responsibility to make sure that those staff are trained and know the consequences, the adverse side effects of those medications and what those medications are for. One that's very key to understand is making sure that those persons who are administering meds are literate. Have you tested anybody to make sure they're literate? That they can actually read the medication administration register, everything. It's very important. We've had experiences in the past where persons were illiterate, could not read. It can cause death. Recently, we've had deaths due to administering medication, the wrong medication, to the wrong resident. It wasn't their medication, it was intended for somebody else. What training are you providing for the use of medications? What training are you providing for therapeutic diets? Do your staff understand what that therapeutic diet is and how it's important for that person? Does your staff understand the medication that they're taking and why it has to be administered at a specific time and cannot be delayed? So it's very important for you all to ensure that that kind of training is being done, that they are truly understanding, they're comprehending, and they are literate to be able to do that.
The residents on a therapeutic diet that refuses to eat that food. I want this. Well, they have the right to do that. But do the staff understand what the possible consequences are of that? Do they know that so that they're documenting, so that they're passing that along to someone so that everybody knows? Otherwise, the therapeutic diet that's been ordered and is being, everyone thinks is being provided is not actually being taken by the residents. So without that knowledge, they're not going to know what to report. So it's important that they have that training, they have that knowledge, they have that skill. The number of personnel required shall be based on the number of residents that are in the personal care home, the type of their personal care needs or supervision, the program that is in place to meet their needs. That is a real subjective kind of thing. You can be an individual who says, you know, we think that we need to have a ratio of this. Well, there is no ratio. This is very subjective. So I need to tell you that if a resident is healthy, their care needs are met, there's no problems, no issues, your staffing is probably adequate. If you start seeing residents being unhappy, residents dirty, the facility not clean, you see problems, it's either one of two things. You don't have enough staff, or the staff you've got aren't doing their job, or they're not trained to do things. So there's some issue. So you can have a 1-to-1 ratio. You can have one staff for every resident in your facility and still have tons of problems. So a lot of times the complaints I get on staffing are from staff that have been fired, staff that have been disciplined. They're calling in. There's not enough staff. You know, there's 12 people on a unit, and they only have 2 staff. There's no ratio. And if those 2 staff are excellent at what they do, I have a problem with that. Or maybe your particular residents in your personal care home require almost no personal assistance. They really just don't need a whole lot of staffing issues. There's not really a problem. So that really and truly is something that we as an agency put back into the facilities lab and say that if there's not a problem and there's no issues, then there's probably not an issue with your staffing. If there are problems, that's one of the areas that we will look at, is what your staffing is. And we talk to residents and we talk to the staff. So to be very aware of that. Moving on to ratios, once again it talks about if the ratios don't meet and if things aren't being completed correctly for the residents, healthcare needs aren't being met, services aren't being met, facilities not being taken care of, then actually our office, which is its old terminology, Division of Licensing and Regulation, can make the decision and the determination about staffing patterns. I truthfully think this has happened, but I can't think of an instance that I'm aware of. Do you guys from Lexington know any time that's Sandy? Do you? So usually, if it's identified, the facility gets it taken care of. Because I mean, I tend to believe that you're not in this industry unless you really want to care about people. You want to see people happy. So if there's an issue with staffing, I think most facilities will take care of it. But if you don't, just be knowledgeable that the Office of Inspector General, Division of Healthcare, can set staffing ratios. Like I said, though, I've not really seen it happen. The administrator of the facility, and this is an administration requirement, has to have people that are assigned these particular responsibilities. And once again, what we're going to require is that whoever's assigned these responsibilities can actually conduct them, and that they're aware of the regulations so that these regulations are met. So we're talking about record keeping, basic health and health-related services, and activity services. Now, you can have licensed personnel taking care of these things or not. There's not a requirement. The requirement is that whoever has been assigned this, that first of all, you have somebody that's assigned, and then second off, that they understand what their job responsibilities are and that they are meeting those job responsibilities. There has to be someone assigned who has a responsibility for the food service operation of the facility, and who has, and then this is very clear cut, on duty a minimum of 35 hours each week. And I'm going to kind of flip through these, but if anybody has questions, let me know, okay? Here is your staffing requirement according to the regulations. So I want to make sure everybody can meet this requirement. Okay? One attendant be awake and on duty on each floor in the facility at all times. I have actually cited this deficiency. Now, it's hard to believe, but I actually went to the facility on third shift and couldn't get in because a person was asleep, but I could see them through the door sitting in a chair asleep. Or the facility had 2 floors, and there was one person on the first floor, but not on the second floor. So don't get cited for this. Of all the regulations not to be cited for, your staff is awake, and they have to be one on each floor of the facility at all times. Okay? And you can't position them at the staircase in the middle of the stair and say, well, they're taking care of the second floor and the first floor. It doesn't work that way. And then also remember, the regulation before talked about having, or 2 before, talked about having staff who can meet the residents' healthcare needs, the appropriate amount of staff. So I'm not telling you that at night one person is enough. This is what is required, minimum. But then the other regulation talked about, that you have enough people on duty to take care of the residents' needs. Okay? And if you don't, we can let you know what that should be. Okay. The person that's designated in charge of medical records shall assure a complete medical record is kept for each resident, and all entries are current, dated, and signed. Entries should be made in ink, ballpoint, or type. So if you're on a computer system, that would be fine for being typed. But those records have to be available. You can't tell our office or a designee from the state, I'm sorry, those records are not available because our record keeper's not here and she's the only person who has a password, who has access. That doesn't work. There has to be somebody in charge who can operate that facility and be responsible for that facility and provide that information to us in a timely manner. Now, you know, if somebody has gone to lunch when I've shown up, that's reasonable. But you can't tell me, come back tomorrow and we'll get that for you. That's not reasonable. Is that kind of reasonable? Medical records, and this is identification information. We won't spend a lot of time with this. I'm actually going to read them for you, but the resident's name, social security number, Medicare, medical assistance identification number, marital status, birth date, age, sex, home address, religion, if they have a personal clergyman, attending physician, dentist, podiatrist, address and phone numbers of each, next of kin, responsible person, address, phone number, date of admission, discharge, the event of a transfer, a copy of the summary of the resident's records to your facility or out of your facility, monthly recording of the resident's weight. Now, I want to talk about a couple of things here quickly without going into too much detail. Marital status. It's 2009. We've got all kinds of things going on in our country, and I'm not going to ask for political views here. But if you have a resident who has a significant other, whether it's a same-sex partner or it's a non-married significant other of the opposite sex, and they come to your facility, the regulations talk about marital status, so they would be considered single. But we're trying to meet residents' needs here, okay? Psychosocial needs. If there's somebody that they care a great deal about, treat that person with respect. Don't just say, oh, well, that's not really a legal spouse, therefore. Now, there's some legal issues that come with that, and I'm not telling you to break the law, but just recognize this resident cares about this individual. Let's be respectful of their relationships. And then we talk about relationships later on, about they have the right to privacy, to visit with people they want to visit with. Just be respectful. Everybody has a political view. Everybody has religious views. I'm not asking you to change any of those. But while you're in this facility, this resident life has been changed. It's been altered. I guarantee you that the majority of people don't want to be in a personal care home or healthcare facility. However, it doesn't mean it cannot become their home. It doesn't mean they cannot have a quality of life that they truly enjoy. But a lot of that is up to you. So I just want to make that, because I get a lot of questions about, well, Mr. Smith is here and his partner of 60 years is coming to visit. Can we allow them to be alone? Well, yes, you can allow them to be alone. So just be, and I understand that, you know, we also have issues where Mr. Smith and Ms. Jones decide they like each other and they're in your facility, which is opening a whole nother can of beans. I understand they're a can of worms. So we have to look at that individually with the residents, cognitive abilities, etc. But they're not in jail. So they have the right to hook up, okay? So we have some issues that go along with that. You know, I am in 2009. So just be very aware that people are people. Don't categorize them just as a resident. They're an individual. I saw a video years ago about a resident, I don't know if it's a CMS video, where the resident was in a wheelchair. And when you heard this voiceover, and he said, you know, you don't know me. What you know is this man who sits in the chair and doesn't talk. And it was very, very heart-wrenching. He said, you don't know that when I was 18, I met the love of my life. And that she was the prettiest girl at the USO show. And he talks about how he had been through hell coming back from war. And how he met this fresh breath air and this beautiful girl. And that how he was clumsy and awkward, and that she took pity on him and went out with him anyway. And it goes on to talk about his life and the birth of his first child, and how scared he was, and how he was even afraid to hold this little baby. And then at 5 years old, the child died. And that how he and his wife didn't think they would recover from it. He goes on to talk about his life, and he says, so now before you sits this guy who doesn't talk, who's in a wheelchair, but I had a life. And it's really important that we remember that, about these are individuals, these are people. They're just like you and I. And one day, it's going to be you and I. So,
and guess what?
remember.
Their life doesn't end by coming to your personal care home. They still have a life. While they may need assistance today, may need assistance tomorrow, they are still as human as you and I are. They still have wants, needs, and desires, just as you and I do. And some do want to hook up. And it may not be with who their daughter thinks they should hook up with.
Right.
So, and that is another can of worms that is opened up. But just remember, while this is their home, it's now their home, and you have to make it a home-like environment, and you have to ensure their privacy and also their happiness. Unfortunately, that's a hard thing to have to cover. The psychosocial well-being of all the individuals you find in your licensed facilities.
I've read through residents' charts that have just broken my heart at the type of suffering that they've gone through in their life, or the end stage of their life. And yet, then when I go meet the resident, she's like, "Oh, come in, I've got to show you my glamour shots. We just went out so-and-so," and there she's all dolled up with boas and everything in this photograph. And I recognized she came here, probably not because she wanted to, but this facility took something that could have been just an awful part of her life, and it's changed it now. So she goes out and gets glamour shots. She does this. They had a beauty pageant at this facility, and they did a twist on it. It was you nominated somebody to be in the beauty pageant, not yourself, and then they would have a group that would get together and make sure they had a talent and make sure they had the right clothes, and it was absolutely fun. And then what I found out was the ladies were talking about the beauty pageant. She said, "Well, it's not real. We take turns who's going to win each year." But it was a lot of fun. So it was not an end of life, you know. So just kind of let you know that there's a lot of wonderful things that are in store for people in your homes. And I say that, but you know that more than I do. I mean, because I didn't come up with this beauty pageant idea. I just got to go there and witness to see what was happening. I've gone to personal care homes that ended up outside in the garden because they want to show me the tomato plants they're growing. Or I've ended up, where they're showing me what they're doing for a local daycare or a local church, or that there was a tragedy in their town, and so they've gotten together to do a food drive or a clothing drive. And these are the residents. These are the poor little people that need care, that can't do anything for themselves. They're taking the initiative. They're still a vital part of their community. Not every personal care home has that type of resident. I'm not saying that every personal care home is going to look the same. They may be doing something that to untrained eyes seems like, well, that's very simplistic, but it may be a huge deal in your personal care home. So don't judge yourself by what another personal care home is doing. Just do the best job you can in yours with your residents. If admitted from another facility, you need to have a discharge summary. And you really need to push that facility. And if that facility is not what's going on with the resident, they're not going to know to make notes of significant changes because they're not going to understand their significance. So make sure your staff are trained. I know we keep going over and over that. Records of accidents, acute illnesses of any resident. Okay? Those also need to be reviewed periodically. You need to track and trim those. Because sometimes, she's just clumsy. Maybe that clumsiness is an indication of something else the physician needs to be aware of. Gosh, this seems to happen at these particular times. Or it seems like in the evenings, maybe she has sundowns. There's just different things that, and if your staff are aware of that, then they're going to be able to relay that information. Third shift staff seem to have the least amount of training. And I don't know if it's because they don't show up for the training. I don't know if it's because, the majority of residents are asleep, we don't need to spend, but a lot of times things happen on third shift. So make sure that staff gets that training. Reports of social services, dental, laboratory, x-rays, special reports, etc. These are, I think, pretty obvious things. Medication and treatment sheets. So your MARs, your TARs, any sort of special procedures performed with date and time. Entries shall be initiated by the personnel rendering the treatment or administering medications. Somebody forgets to put an entry in there. What's your policy and procedure on that? How often are you checking that? Because I will tell you, the last thing you want is a state agency. You don't want Jerry to come up and say, "Can I see your MAR?" And okay, she had 1 dose of this medication per day for 30 days. I count, she got 10. How come she got 10? Why are these others blamed? Well, she refused. How do I know that? How do I know you forgot? So, and then, what if she's on Dilantin? What if she has seizures? So now we've got the majority of the amount missed, and she's on a medication that's pretty serious. Well, she may have actually taken them, and you should have to still write them down. But how do you know that? How do I know that? That's very important stuff. How does the doctor know that? So just be very aware of that. Same thing with treatment. Pretty much anything you have an order for that you need to be tracking, you need to have policies and procedures. So if the staff who comes on looks at it and says, oh, I don't know if they gave that to her or not, hope they don't get in trouble. Or do they know, hey, I need to call so-and-so and tell them this record's not marked, so you can call that person and say, did you give the medication? Do we need to go count the medication to determine is there X amount missing or whatever? Yes, it was given. Then we have a policy of how we annotate that was given even though the MAR was not filled out. You need to know what your policies and procedures are. Reports of the use of physical restraints, procedures used, and the checks and releases of physical restraints. We talked about restraints earlier. So make sure any time a restraint comes up that you have documented and you have every single thing that you can show, every single thing the facility did related to that restraint. Discharge destination. After the death of discharge, the completed medical record should be placed in an inactive file and retained for 5 years. Okay? In the case of a minor, 3 years after they reach the age of majority under state law, whichever is the longest. So, I come into your facility. There's really no statute of limitations for an investigation of a complaint. The state agency will sometimes make decisions based on things. The federal government gives us some guidelines on federal facilities. But basically, if somebody complains that they did not receive the appropriate medication at your facility 3 years ago when they were there, and I come out to investigate it, I need to see that MAR from 3 years ago on that resident. Are you going to be able to show it to me? Now, a reasonable person would not expect you to say, oh, I have that in my drawer right here. You probably have that in files in storage. Now, they may be at your facility or they may be off-site, but can you obtain those records for me and not say, well, it's going to take 6 months while I go digging through whatever? And are they in a place that a reasonable person would think that they're secure? You know, don't tell me they're in the shed out back that doesn't have a lock on it. Or they're in the basement right now and there's a foot of water down there. There needs to be some reasonable, and you knew the basement flooded. I mean, things happen. We had a flood in the L&M building in Louisville, and like I said, I've worked for the state for a while, and that's never happened before, and we lost a lot of records. But the reasonable thought was we hadn't had a flood down there in the 30 years I've worked for state government. So, but to have reasonable efforts, and you have to have these files. You can't tell me we can't find it. Okay? So make sure that you keep those files. That is a requirement. And if you don't have it, was it administered? Do you think I'm gonna say, oh, it's unsubstantiated? It's probably going to be substantiated against you because I have no evidence to show that the facility actually followed the regulation. So, especially there's enough people out there pointing fingers at you every single day that when you do something, make sure you get credit for it. And storing a record is really not that difficult. So make sure that you get credit for what you've done. Basic health and health-related services. This is the tag that you will see more often than not whenever there's an issue found with healthcare services being provided to a resident. Okay? This is where you're going to find it. And this basically, I'm going to read this. All personal care homes shall provide basic health and health-related services, including, and here's the big one, continuous supervision and monitoring of the resident to assure that the resident's healthcare needs are being met, supervision of self-administration of medications, storage and control of medications when necessary, and making arrangements for obtaining therapeutic services ordered by the resident's physician which are not available in the facility. can you kind of see, this is very general, but by doing that, it actually encompasses pretty much most of what you do for that resident in that facility. So this is where you're going to see a lot of issues related to care and services or quality of care of a resident site. Supervision, we'll talk about. Samantha's actually going to talk about that. We're going to talk about supervision of the residents, continuous supervision. We've talked a little bit already about assessments and making sure that we know what the residents' needs are. We talked about training staff so that they're aware of it. Well, let's Sam jump in.
As Jerry's already spoken to you about continuous supervision, by the way, we have 10 minutes. We're not just going to spend the next 10 minutes on this. We'll probably surpass this tag and keep talking about it because this is your key tag. This is key right here. You have a resident who's adjudicated incompetent and your staff didn't realize that they were to have continuous supervision. You didn't make sure that you knew what their adjudication was and they left your building without your knowledge. You don't have a system in place to determine who has left the building. You don't have a sign-out policy. Staff residents don't know that they're supposed to sign out and this person leaves. However, they're adjudicated incompetent. They're not to be left alone. They're supposed to have supervision, and they're not supposed to leave your facility without supervision. Continuous supervision and monitoring. It's key. It's your responsibility. How many of you have a locked unit in your facility with dementia? Okay. Continuous supervision. Why do you have them in a locked unit? They require continuous supervision, correct? They get out of your locked unit. Are you providing continuous supervision to them when they've left your building or they've left your unit? The responsibility of your facility is to provide continuous supervision. I'm going to keep reiterating that over and over. In speaking with my father, he said, if you say something 7 times, it becomes memory. If you do something for 10 weeks in a row, it becomes habit. So we'll say it more than 7 times so that it's memory, okay? One of the key aspects is your knowledge of your staff knowing what that supervision is. We're not saying in a personal care home that you have to provide one-to-one supervision for every resident in the facility, but it's your responsibility as a facility provider to be able to assess your residents, find out what their actual needs are. And if they are one who requires one-to-one because they've just eloped and managed to get out without your staff knowing, you would have to take measures to identify how did they get out? Have they had a mental status change? What's going on with that resident? If we're in a locked unit and we have a wander guard system or some kind of care guard system, and we test those wander guard bracelets every day and we make sure that the batteries are working, what happened? How did the resident get out? Did they get out of the existing building because they look like Jane Doe's sister who came to visit? Did they exit the facility? Did they actually cut off their wander guard bracelet? Were you aware that the person has been trying to get the bracelet off? Is someone in your staff aware that they're trying to get the bracelet off? Or do you have a facility where you've got the wander guard system working on 1 or 2 doors, but you also have a door over here that nobody ever goes out of? It goes out to a courtyard, and it's an enclosed courtyard with a gate. That resident goes out to that courtyard, which isn't on a wander guard system. She has a bracelet on, but she's able to go out to that courtyard. She figures out how to jerry-rig that gate, and you have some little contraption on there to keep them from going out the gate. They were successful in getting out, and your staff were none the wiser. You don't know how long she's been gone. You just realized it's 6 a.m. The last time your staff recalls seeing that resident was at 2 a.m. rounds. They've been gone for 4 hours. It's 20 degrees outside. She was in a nightie. She had no shoes on. It's cold. There's snow on the ground. how was your staff supervising that resident? How did you prevent an accident from occurring to that resident who requires supervision? It's very important that you become aware of if an event like that occurs in your facility, that you investigate to identify the problems. You have a resident, we've had residents who've gone into what they consider a safe zone, that lovely courtyard that's gated, and the resident scaled the wall of the courtyard.
I think the one Samantha's talking about, the gentleman was admitted to the facility. He weighed 120 pounds. He was short of stature, slight build, very quiet, very meek. They thought he was lovely. He was there for 2 weeks. He was very well-mannered, spoke softly, and then scaled. It was actually 15 feet. He was an ex-Navy SEAL. And he decided he didn't want to be there anymore.
So he scaled the wall.
He went outside and scaled the wall. So it's something to just be aware of who your residents are. But also it came to supervision. There was a false sense of security that staff had. Now, I have to tell you, I kind of use that word false because when I usually look at personal care home residents, I'm going to assume that most of them cannot scale a 15-foot wall. So I don't know if I think that's really false sense of security. But there was a sense of security that obviously was in error. That this resident was going to be in this facility and not be able to get out. That was a 15-foot wall. Come on. So we do give, some reasonable thought to this stuff. But often that doesn't happen. A locked unit, the staff sometimes have a false sense of security. We're in a locked unit, so we're up here having a chit-chat about what happened on Saturday night or about so-and-so's baby shower or whatever it may be, and a resident gets out through whatever reason. We've had residents who didn't think she could climb out a window. Well, she could.
Took a butter knife, cut the window screen, got through the window.
All right, we had a resident who not only cut off her window guard, she cut off 2 other residents' window guards. She wanted company when they made their step. So be very aware. Don't place all of your supervision on a locked door or an alarm system. Because, like I said, it'll come back and bite you.
The one thing that we're going to say to you is remember, think about how you would feel. How does that make you feel? You've got this bracelet on you for the rest of your life. Would you be determined? She says she'd be determined to get it off. Would you want it on? Oh, and they think that if they just put it on the back of my shirt and every time I lean back, I feel that big old knot back there. Would you want that? Would that be comfortable to you? So we're going to ask you to think about how a reasonable person would feel in that situation. And remember, there's reasons why residents refuse. There's reasons why residents want to get up and walk. That's why they keep falling. There's reasons why they do that. And it's your responsibility, and we'll continue this because we've got to wrap it up and go for lunch. And we'll talk about falls and incidents and accidents because it all gets cited under this tag later. So just remember, reasonable person and what your responsibility is and how would it make you feel in that situation. Because we're human too, right? But we're on the outside. We can get in our car and we can drive away. Some of us still get in the car and drive away. So go to lunch. What time